Welcome to the Great Sources, Season 2, Episode 27. Today's shir is called What Makes Eretz Yisrael Special, Part 6, How to See Beneath the Surface. Okay, so we've been speaking about the concept of having what we termed a heavenly system on Earth. Let's just talk about that a little bit before we move on to the unique point that is going to be today's main discussion. So, what does it mean to have a heavenly system? What would it look like? What would that look like in practice? So the first thing is you have to have, in order to be able to implement a heavenly system on earth, you have to have a very rich and deep conception of the good. We've been speaking about this. And that means the heavenly good. Meaning the goodness that inheres in reality when you strip out human interest and human selfishness. That means you have to have a concept of God's reality before or minus human input and human perspective. So you have to have a very good conception of that. You have to work on that. And then you have to figure out, okay, now that inspires you and that's meaningful to you, you have to consider how to emulate that, how to apply it. So the more you know about the heavenly good, meaning the more you have a sense that you could say, okay, here's what God is doing, I get it. Here's what his world is all about. The more you can use that sense of goodness and apply it to human affairs. The more you can serve as, let's call it, God's representative in earth. So it's something you really have to work on, and I personally intend to study this in a deeper way, to really give thought and time and analysis and reading to thinking about what is good and understanding the good that's inherent in reality. What is it? How do I relate to it? How do I define it? Once you can understand what is good, maybe existence is the ultimate goodness, maybe knowledge, maybe justice, maybe pleasure, maybe all of the above. And if you understand how that's good and in what proportion it's good, then you have a strong sense of what's real, but you have a strong sense about the value of what's real, about what makes what's real valuable, and therefore then you're ready to go forward and say, I want to do the same thing. So again, you have to really think about reality, and for this reason studying existence is very important. But like I made this point before, we're not talking about studying science for science's sake, especially modern science is really about the laws of nature, the mathematics. We're talking about a philosophy of nature, understanding what does it mean in Bereshis where it says that God saw that everything is taiv. What did he see as being taiv and why? That's what we're talking about. So you have to think about that, understand that well. And then you have something to work with. Then you can replicate that system here down below. And you can, what we've been talking about, make heaven on earth. Which means, again, take the sense, the good sense and the true sense. It has to be true. And if it's false, then you're in trouble. The sense of what heaven is like, meaning what God's reality is like, before human perspective mixes in. And then, only after you have that sense, where you're willing to be fully human and to start relating to things in your way, because it's informed by your understanding of God's reality. So that's a new model for how we should order human affairs on planet Earth. And that's what we've been talking about. That's Eretz Yisrael. That's what it means to sanctify an Eretz. You would have a heavenly everything. Whatever you order, any system that you order based on that model, would be heavenly. And we can say the Shekhinah would dwell therein. Again, like I mentioned in a previous discussion, what does it mean the Shekhinah will dwell therein? It means that God is comfortable there because this is what he likes, this is what he does, and you're continuing what he does. That causes Ashras HaShekhinah. Whether you create a community on this model, or an economy, or a government, or even a household, anything that you use consciously, I mean, you don't have to be conscious about it, but I think if you're conscious about it, there's more chance of it working. Anything where you consciously think, okay, what's good? Why is good? And you use all of reality as an inspiration and as a source for understanding what's good in a true way. And then you take that and you apply that. And you replicate that. And you emulate that. Then you're creating a place for the Shekhinah. You are sanctifying the earth and you are recreating heaven on earth. So that's the challenge. That's the ideal. And I think it's a wonderful paradigm for us to think about. I keep on saying, don't wait for Eretz Yisrael to do this. Let's start here and now. And let's do what's called be mitaher Eretz Ha'amim, which is what I'm talking about, sanctifying, purifying the whole world, which will eventually get to Kedusha of Eretz Yisrael. Eretz Yisrael is the place where this can be done to its fullest extent, as we've been discussing numerous times, because that's where you have Avram Avinu who started doing it. That's where the conditions of Ahayim Shemayah that contributed to Avram Avinu's way of getting to our Eka hold. That's where those conditions hold. And that's where we can be a people and do it together as a nation that continues Avram Avinu's mission. Okay, so we've been talking about, we want to see the arts in the right way, right? Meaning specifically in the context of the Chet HaMeraglim, who were sent to see the Aretz, U'Reisemas Aretz Mahi, and they failed. That is, 10 out of 12 of them failed, and they led the people, the nation, to their downfall, to not having the true Re'iyah of the Aretz. So what I want to talk about today, this brings us to the new thing. If we're going to think about the Meraglim and think about what should we do to make sure that we are not Meraglim, which is really the question, right? Meaning, as we've been discussing, the question of whether you accomplish understanding what Eretz Yisrael is all about, and you believe that it's doable and achievable, is literally the question that faced the Meraglim. And there's something else that the Torah teaches us, something else we can learn from the Meraglim, from the Parashat Shlach, that will help us understand a tool for us to achieve the proper Re'iyah. Okay, that's what this is about. This is about sight, this is about seeing, how to see, how not to see. And we can look in Parashat Shlach, we can learn something about what the right way to see is and how we can get it, okay? So there's a clue right there in Parashat Shlach, really right there in the open, and this clue is what we're going to be following, this clue for its logical conclusions, and we'll see what this means. The clue is as follows, and if you're following the source sheets, I'm going to try to go in order here with the Psukim and the other sources from Chazal. Some of these are there. And by the way, what I'm discussing today is basically the content of an unpublished essay that I wrote, which, because it's unpublished, I'll attach it to this shir so that you can download that. That's called Kosnois Or, and that contains everything we're talking today and a lot more, because I'm giving you the main nekudas that are necessary to understand how not to be a spy, how not to be the Meraglim, the bad Meraglim. Maybe I should say how to succeed as a Meraglim. Maybe that's the right way to say it, because there were 12 Meraglim, 2 of them succeeded, saw things correctly. Okay, so how to succeed as a Meraglim. So there it says in Parashat Shlach, Shlach lecha anoshim v'yasuru es Eretz Canaan. Send off people who are going to tour look around the land of Canaan. Okay, we know how that went. And then Parashat Shlach ends with the Parasha of Tzitzis. And in the Parasha of Tzitzis, it also uses this not common word, tur, and it says, V'lo yisasuru acharei levavchem v'acharei einechem. So, and of course, in the Parasha of Tzitzis, it says, Ureisem oisai. Tzitzis gives you something to look at. So what this suggests is that, in the beginning of the Parasha, there was a failed Yasuru, a failed Re'iyah, one that went the wrong way. And Tzitzis, the Parasha of Tzitzis, is here to rectify that. Tzitzis somehow is going to teach us how to do Re'iyah and how not to be tar, not to be led astray and follow our hearts and eyes. So Tzitzis contains then the key to how to be a successful Meragel. Okay, so we want to pursue that. And another clue is that, of course, we put tzitzis on only clothing that has four corners, arba kanfos. And there's something else that has four kanfos, and that's the oretz, arba kanfos oretz. And there are many psukim that talk about the kanfos ha'oretz. That's number 3, number 4, and number 5 in the source sheet. Number 5, I brought the whole pasuk that talks about the knaf ha'oretz, because the end of the pasuk says this very interesting phrase that the Navi says. The Navi heard the songs from the knaf ha'oretz, from the corners of the earth. It's a beautiful psukim. And he says, Oili, woe to me, baigdim bagadu, uveged baigdim bagadu. Beged means treachery or betrayal. And he says a great betrayal. He hears songs Miknaf Haaretz and he says Begdim Bagadu, Beged Begdim Bagadu. I note that pasuk because soon we're going to talk about Begadim and betrayal. But there you have a pasuk that connects Begida and the Knaf Haaretz. And of course, as we say, Havarabi, and you take the tzitzis. So there are four things. There are two things that have four kanfos, the oretz and the tzitzis. And the Meraglim were sent to look at the oretz. They did so incorrectly. And then there's the four-cornered clothing, which the tzitzis is guaranteeing, or is supposed to guarantee, that we should look at that in the correct way. Okay, that seems to be the idea over here. Like I said, this attached essay contains all the sources and it's very rich and really keeps on going. And you are welcome to please download that and study that. But I'm going to stick to really what's necessary for us, for our purposes. And I'm not going to give you all the sources and how this all pulls together. I wanted to focus on what we need. So, tzitzis can teach us, right? Tzitzis can teach us to be a successful Meragel. How is that? So here's the idea. There's a very interesting parallel between the whole of creation and its relationship to Hashem and man's clothing, the clothing of humans. And here's how. The whole of creation by the Nevi'im, and this is sources number 6 and number 7, are termed or given a mashal is given for the whole of creation of being the clothing of Hashem. It's as if Hashem is dressed up in this world. In other words, dressed up, what I mean to say is he doesn't appear to us in his own self. We can't perceive God's essence, as everyone's been saying for a very long time. What we can perceive is the way he appears to us. He puts on clothing, and it's as if he's invisible, but he puts on clothing and we see his clothing. And the Nevi'im talk about heaven and earth, the whole of creation. It's very important. The heaven too is God's clothing. Everything is God's clothing. And the Nevi'im also talk about this idea that like clothing, which eventually you replace because the old clothing can get worn out and you get new clothing, so too the heavens and earth will be worn out and Hashem will get a new set of clothing. Okay. Now, let me say a word about that. you know what? Soon we'll get to. I said there's a parallel between Hashem's clothing and man's clothing. We'll get to that in a moment. But first, I want to say a word about this idea about the heavens and earth being Hashem's clothing. So I mentioned before that there's an association between beged, clothing, and begida, betrayal. Similarly, you have the word me'il. Me'il means a cloak, and me'ilah, ki ma'ala mal bi'isha, also betrayal. So what is this about clothing and betrayal? It's very simple, because clothing is a way to disguise yourself, right? So thinking about, and therefore a way to fool someone that it's something that you're not, right? I'm wearing certain clothing, I present myself a certain way. Perhaps I am the way I present myself, perhaps I'm not. Now, the fact that the whole of creation as Hashem's clothing becomes very important, because that becomes very significant, because clothing has this tendency to betray, to hide. Which means then, when we talk about creation being Hashem's clothing, there's a possibility that the clothing will represent Hashem. It means we'll see creation. That's what we sense. We only sense Hashem's actions. We don't sense Hashem himself. There's a possibility that through his actions, which are his clothing, we can adequately develop a conception of him. There's also a possibility that it will betray and lead us astray and lead us to think that Hashem is something other than he is, or that there's nothing behind the clothing. Okay, so that's a parenthetical point. Now, once upon a time, let's continue with this mashal. It's a little bit of a complicated mashal, but the main thing is the nimshal. So just bear with me with the mashal, and we'll get soon to the nimshal. Once upon a time, say the Nevi'im, Hashem's clothing was light. Oita or kasama. Once upon Hashem, Hashem's clothing was light. That's the original light the Chazal talk about having been put away. When was it put away? When Adam Rishon sinned and ate from the E27, Hashem took that light and he was goynez it. So Rishos, evil, causes Hashem to be goynez that light. So it used to be Hashem's clothing was light. That's what Hashem's clothing was. And then that light was put away. Now let's talk about how there's a parallel between, I said there's a parallel between Hashem's clothing and human clothing. Humans too, once upon a time, had clothing made out of light, which after they ate from the E27 became the clothing that we're familiar with. Of course, we know that clothing is very important in the story of the E27. They found out that they were naked, they realized they were naked, and they covered their nudity. So the Medrash says on the pasuk Vayas Hashem Elokim la'adam v'le'ishtoi ule'ishtoi kosnes or vayalbishem. Hashem made clothing for Adam and his wife. So kosnes or with an ayin. And the Gemara, the Medrash says that in Rameir's Sefer Torah, there's a Sefer, and his Sefer Torah it said kosnes or with an aleph, and which means cloaks of light, clothing of light, shirts of light. And the Zohar says originally Adam and Chava wore clothing that was made out of or. Their clothing was made out of light. And eventually, after they sinned, they too, as we said, like HaKadosh Baruch Hu originally was cloaked in light, in a talis made out of light, as it were. He then puts on this other clothing. So too Adam and Chava originally had clothing made out of light, and they lost that, and had to put on other clothing, the natural clothing that we're familiar with. Now, that's the whole mashal, and now I want to explain to you what this means. When clothing is light, right, what does it mean? Well, imagine I'm wearing clothing that's light. Basically, that means I'm naked, because what that means is that you could see me, right? That's what it would mean to wear clothing made out of light. What it means is that anything can be seen, or that, even another way to put it, the clothing, the thing that I'm wearing over me, doesn't conceal me, it serves to reveal me. That's what clothing of light is. So Hashem is dressed. Creation is not Hashem, it's his clothing. But his clothing could be light, which means it could serve as a perfectly see-through covering, meaning a covering that perfectly represents, absolutely and accurately represents fully what is beneath it. That's what clothing of light means. It's covered, but the covering in no way obscures. Rather, the covering allows you to see something. Instead of seeing the thing itself, you can see something that accurately represents the thing itself. So I don't want this to be too complicated. No need for that. And it's really not. The idea is creation could have been, and once was, a perfect representation of God. Meaning one could see creation, and understand Hashem through it fully. Similarly, now let's go back to, then there was a sin, right? There was a sin. And now we introduce the possibility of seeing evil. We don't see things fully. We don't see Hashem fully. Now Hashem is no longer dressed in light because the world can be misunderstood. Heavens and earth can be misunderstood. Now Hashem's clothing is not light anymore. It means his whole creation can be misunderstood. We look at it and we think about it in a different way than he meant. We think about it from a human perspective. And therefore, Hashem is no longer dressed in clothing made out of light. He's dressed in clothing made out of all sorts of things, somewhat dark. Now let's take that back to the human, to man and his wife. Without going into the whole story of the Eitz Hadas and how it relates to nudity and what that's all about, that's not important for now. Let's think about it. Originally, they wore clothing of light, which means their clothing revealed them. Their clothing revealed them. That means the essence of what man was able to be revealed through the way he appeared. What happened after they ate from the tree of knowledge of good and evil? They covered their nakedness, right? They covered their nakedness, which means, what does it mean to cover your nakedness? Think about it. We always think about it as like, okay, I'm covering my nakedness. But really, who's not allowed to see a person's nakedness? Someone else, right? So that means wearing clothing is this decision that we're not going to look. There's this thing called looking, this sight. God gave us sight so that we should do something with it, and it should lead us to the right place. But we're basically putting blinders over our eyes. We're saying there are certain things that we're not going to look at, which basically means, why wouldn't we look at certain things? What that means is certain things that we know ourselves, and we know that if we look at it, we're going to look incorrectly. It's not going to lead us to the truth. That's what erva means. That's what erva is. Something that if you look at, you're pretty sure that you're going to misunderstand. You're pretty sure that you're going to think selfish thoughts and not absolutely true thoughts. Okay, so now, originally again, let's talk about this. Originally, the whole world, including the humans, including the erva, was something that could be perceived, could be seen, doesn't have to be hidden, because it was able to accurately represent and reflect its inner truth, what it's really about. Like Hashem was dressed in clothing, so too man and Chava, Adam and Chava. Once man learned a corrupt way of seeing, and instead of seeing only Tov, saw Tov and Ra too, now man says, you know what, I'm going on a diet from seeing. Because some things don't accurately represent. I'm not able to see how the externalities truly represent some truth. So instead I do what? I cover it up. Which basically is like I blinded myself. Okay. And now we're ready to get the tzitzis. Because now there's two ways to think about it. And this is where tzitzis comes in. Wearing clothing, when humans wear clothing, what we're doing is, it's basically we're saying there's certain things that should not be seen. Okay? Now, of course, clothing also keeps us warm and protects our skin. We're not talking about that. We're talking about simple, voracious clothing that they, had to cover their nakedness, because basically we're deciding not to see certain things. Okay? It's very similar to be like, okay, let's say there are trees and there's grass and there's animals, and we decide certain things do not see. Don't look at them. It's like we're taking off. Those things are not to be seen, not to be part of our visual sense of what is. Of course, sometimes you see it, but it's only under certain circumstances, and it's not like part of our what is there visually, what presents to our mind visually and immediately. It's covered. It's hidden. So now we're going to get to where tzitzis comes in, because now there's a question. So we covered the erva, which means that the human body is no longer, we don't consider the human body a good source for getting to the tov. We believe that if we look at the human body in and of itself, it's going to lead us to tov and also ra. It's not going to lead to pure tov. That's why we decide to cover the human body. So now we have a very important question. We cover the human body. We're basically designating human body as being a source of ra and erva. We cover it up. Okay? Take the human and cover him up. Now we have a question. A very, very important question. Is this an absolute statement? Is the human body permanently and absolutely a source of Ra, such that it should stay covered and we should forget about it? Or, which basically means we're doomed. We're doomed to Toiv and Ra. We're doomed to death. We're doomed to everything that the tree of life brought to humanity. To the tree of knowledge of good and evil brought upon humanity. Or perhaps we cover it up because currently we are not able to look at a human body and see the Toiv without seeing Ra, without becoming desirous, without seeing things that are self-centered. But not that we believe that the human body is inherently Ra, irredeemably Ra. Okay? That's a question. Is it irredeemably Ra, such that it should be covered and put away? Or should it only be temporarily covered? Now here, let's get to tzitzis. Here's where strings on the corner of clothing takes on great meaning. The four-cornered beged, four-cornered clothing, is clothing that can, having four corners, it can cover something up completely. Okay, so you could take a human and you could cover him completely. And then you wouldn't even know that there's someone behind the four-cornered garment. There's nothing to see. Nothing to see here, right? Nothing to see here. Move on. Strings on the corner tells you, it's simply a message, simply a marking that there's something behind this, that there's something behind this cloak. It's a marking that don't forget to pick this up. Don't forget that there's something beneath the surface that eventually has to be discovered, that the good of which must be seen and must be discovered. Don't put away the human body forever. Okay? That's the simple idea. When we live in a world where we have to cover things up, where there's a surface level to things, because we don't trust ourselves to get to the true inner meaning of things. So therefore we create surfaces that we're okay seeing. We're okay seeing clothing. Doesn't do anything to us. It's fine to see clothing. But what happens is when we made a world of clothing, what we did was we made a world of superficiality. We made a world where there is something on the surface that does not necessarily reflect something on the inside. And the question is, are we recreating the world? Are we creating now a world of surfaces, a world of superficiality? Or do we want to remember that all of the superficial world that presents itself to our eyes is really an illusion and a portal to get into something deeper, to get behind and to see beyond? That's what the tzitzis alludes to. The strings tell you, don't take this at face value. Recognize that there's something bifnim, there's something eternal, there's something deep. Okay, so what does this have to do? We'll get back to how to see soon, but I want to just put together the whole mashal. Hashem originally was wearing clothing of light, and then he loses his clothing of light. Instead, he wears clothing that are dark. The whole heavens and earth are Hashem's clothing. Similarly, humans have clothing. Again, when man sinned, right? When man sinned, such that man sees good and evil too, Hashem is no longer completely visible because man doesn't see only the good. He sees evil too. So Hashem becomes hidden, invisible. Or maybe I should say imperceptible, because even through his clothing, even through creation, which is his clothing, we don't necessarily perceive him. Similarly, man, who should only be toiv, just like all of creation is toiv, man is also only good. But man sees good and evil, and he sees evil because he's selfish, and he sees selfishness in man too, focused on the erva. So therefore, man also covers up and doesn't trust himself to be seen. Marking off the clothing with strings is saying that although there's a surface here that doesn't match what's behind it, you should remember that there's something internal, there's something behind the surface, and there's something that you want to get to, you want to get back to. Just like in the world, which is no longer enlightened, meaning it doesn't automatically serve. The earth has four corners, it completely conceals. It doesn't automatically serve as this conduit or a portal for us to see Hashem. We have to remember that There's something beyond it. There's something behind it. Okay. Now, let's take this to another point, which is also related. If we talk about... Oh, I just want to mention, this is really what the Medrash says, that the Pasuk says, the Medrash Tehillim says, or E27. The Pasuk says, by tzitzis, you should see the it, or him. And the Medrash points out, it doesn't say see them, the strings. It says him, or it, referring to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So that's it. You look at the strings, you see HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Why? How do you see HaKadosh Baruch Hu when you look at the strings? Because looking at the strings tells you there is something behind. There is something deeper than the surface. This is not just a surface, not just a plane. There's something behind it. And using that paradigm of seeing, and then applying that to everything in the world, and realizing everything in the world is something that's a manifestation or a surface level interaction with something deeper, that's seeing HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Okay. Now, I want to talk about another point here, which is going to bring us back to specifically to the Parsha of the Raglim. We talked about the question of, okay, the earth has four corners. Is the earth like clothing? Does it cover something completely and forget about what's beneath it? Or are we supposed to remind ourselves that there's something behind it? Now, if you think about the earth as being a covering, concealing something that we might actually forget about forever, or perhaps no, we don't forget about forever because eventually we're going to get back to it, what immediately comes to mind is all the corpses, all the dead bodies that are in the earth, right? If you talk about this whole concept, like, okay, there's surfaces and there are things behind them, and sometimes we forget that there are things behind them because we get so into the world of surfaces. Well, and then we apply that to the earth. So it's similar, we're talking about HaKadosh Baruch Hu being behind everything, that Hashem is hidden within his clothing, which is the whole of creation. But if you think about the earth specifically, not the heavens, the earth, what does the earth cover? All the dead people, right? We open up the earth, put the dead person in, cover it up, and then forget about him. It's as if like it's like all these living people that are roaming around on the surface. It's as if they don't even remember that, right under us is like all these dead bodies, and we totally forget about it, which basically means we accept the earth as being the ultimate covering, instead of thinking what's behind it. And this is also appears in the Nevi'im, and Yeshaya talks about that when the Pesukim that talk about Tchias HaMeisim, that the dead will one day come out of the earth, and the pasuk talks about the earth will no longer cover up on all the people that were killed. It's as if the earth serves as this great beged, as this great kisui, hiding death. And what we have to remember is, like the tzitzis teaches us about our own clothing, that there really is something beneath the surface. And this is just a temporary covering. And don't think that the surface level reality is the whole reality. So, I want to explain to you Bekitzer. Again, this is, like I said, you could look at the essay if you want to understand it better. I really am trying to go a little quickly through the mashal so that we can get to the nimshal, really, and think about how it applies to seeing the Eretz and what we can do about it. But what I say is like this: the question of whether the earth is a complete covering for the dead, or whether eventually the dead will come out again, is the exact same question as whether clothing is a permanent covering for the human body, which is irredeemably evil, or will we one day discover the toiv in everything? It's the same exact question. Why? Because what happened when man ate from the tree of good and of knowledge and good and evil? He became mortal. So Maves comes along with Ra, and specifically the Ra that's in the body, the Erva. Of course, if there's Ra in the body, then the body can't be forever and has to die. So the question of whether death is permanent, or perhaps death will one day be reversed, is the same question as whether the body's evil, which necessitated clothing, is permanent. So the clothing on the body and the clothing that the earth serves to cover up its dead, and the clothing that heaven and earth are in general, in terms of concealing the goodness of Hashem, is all one and the same question. All one and the same question. So there's three things we're talking about. The Or, Hashem's original light, which was his clothing until man ate from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. the clothing of man that was light until they ate from the Eitz Hadas Tov Ra, and the fact that there was no death until they ate from the Eitz Hadas Tov Ra. All of those three things are depend on tzitzis. Why? Because tzitzis is what tells us. Oita Urka Salmo, the Gemara says, like Hashem was wearing a talis. Tzitzis tells us that there's something beneath the surface, and hence there's a connection, a strong connection between tzitzis and Tchias HaMesim. The proofs to this are very clear. Look in the essay, but I'll quote you. Rabbeinu Bechaya says clearly in Parashas Bamidbar that it's a remez that a Kodesh Baruch Hu is going to eventually be Mechayim Mesim and bring them back with their clothing, and that's what tzitzis is a remez for. Okay, so maybe you remember Shem and Yefes covered their father. Shem was zeicha to tzitzis, and Yefes is zeicha to burial. The two things are very much related, except that burial, you can cover up the body and forget about it. Tzitzis is that don't forget about the body. And that's because Yefes cared about the externalities and Shem cared about the inner, the shame, the essence of Nech. Okay, we're getting way too off topic here. The point is, what we have to understand is to understand the basics for how we're supposed to be successful Meraglim. What we have to know is the following. That Veloisa Suru, Tzitzis teaches us Veloisa Suru, how? Or tzitzis teaches us how to look at things correctly, because tzitzis tells us that every surface is merely that, merely a surface. And every surface that presents itself to our eyes is something that reflects and serves as a portal to an inner reality, to a truth, which I'm going to explain more soon. But now I want to just tell you how this gets us really right back to the Meraglim. Because look at it this way, if the question of tzitzis is about Tchias HaMesim, right? Does the body have to be covered up forever because the body is irredeemably evil and must die? Does the earth cover the bodies that are in it forever, or will they eventually be revealed? And if tzitzis is the antidote to the failed Meraglim, that suggests then that the Meraglim weren't aware of Tchias HaMesim. They didn't understand resurrection of the dead. And that is very true, and I'll tell you why. Because as we've been discussing, the whole question of the Meraglim is conceptually whether a land can be made holy. But specifically, the question is, given that Avram Avinu didn't succeed, the fact that Avram Avinu didn't succeed suggests that it's impossible. But it didn't happen. Well, what do you mean it didn't happen? Okay. Avram Avinu has to finish it. Maybe we could continue it. Yeah, but look what happened to Avram Avinu. Instead of getting Eretz Amariah, instead of purchasing the Beis HaMikdash, he purchased a burial plot from Ephraim, Mr. Offer, as we discussed, the one who represents that there's no difference between me and you when it comes to Eretz. Eretz is not a holy thing. Eretz cannot be sanctified. Eretz cannot be transcended. Eretz can't be made heavenly. That's what Ephraim represents. And that's seemingly what's represented by the fact that Avraham Avinu's career and in relation to Eretz Yisrael ends with the burial of Sarah in the Maras Machpelah, right? As we discussed last week and 2 weeks ago, rather, both. I think I just want to mention we spoke about last week about the contrast to Eiv. I noticed afterwards, I should have realized this before. The Gemara in Baba Basra says that the Satan came to Hashem and reported to him that specifically, the Gemara says, the Satan reported to Hashem that he hasn't found a tzaddik like Avram in the whole land, because even though you told him, still when he needed to bury Sarah, he had no place to bury her and he had to pay for it, and he still wasn't Mahar Achamidesecha, to which Hashem responded, yeah, but have you seen Eiv? He's really special. So you see from that Gemara is what I've been discussing, that the fact that Avram Avinu, the fact is, the Gemara is saying that Kum his halech ba'aretz la'arka l'rachba was not fulfilled to Avram Avinu. A, that's one thing you see from that Gemara, and B, what you see from that Gemara is that the story of the purchase of Machpelah is where you see that it wasn't fulfilled because he had to go buy this rocky place in Hebron. And C, what you see from that Gemara is that that's the point of contention between Avram and Eiv, as we discussed last week. But again, what I want to bring out now, let's get this clear. There's a conceptual question: can Bnei Yisrael, or anyone else for that matter, sanctify the earth? That's a very good question. There's a very specific question in terms of Avram Avinu that, given that Avram Avinu was supposed to do this, but l'chayra he didn't, and not just l'chayra he didn't, sort of the opposite happened, because instead of him getting a holy land, he got a land of death, of contamination, of tumah. He got the land from Ephron, from Mr. Ophir, a place of burial. That suggests then that ultimately Eretz is unholy. Aha. Well, does it? Well, it depends. When you put Sarah in the ground and you cover her with the earth, is the earth supposed to make you forget that there's a living being or a human being beneath it that was once alive? In that case, then yes, the burial of Sarah in Ephron's plot indicates that all we are is just Ophir. Hakal hoya mina Ophir, v'hakal shavel Ophir will become part of the earth. But if the earth is a clothing that has tzitzis, meaning you're not supposed to forget about what's beneath it. You're supposed to recognize that there's something beneath the surface. You're supposed to recognize that there's a tzaddikus buried in Hebron who will eventually rise and come back from the dead. Then, what does that mean? That means the body, which has Ra, will eventually become Toiv. Misa will eventually turn into life. And the Eretz will eventually become heavenly. The Eretz will eventually turn into Kedusha, because it's only serving now as a temporary covering, for the holiness that's hidden deep beneath it, and that we don't have access to because it's concealed. So the idea, this by the way is the idea, the Kalev going to Hebron and davening at the Maras Machpelah. It's because the whole point of contention between Yeshua and Kalev and the other 10 is how to understand the burial of Sarah in Hebron. Is it an end, or is it just a point on the journey? When you cover up a dead body with the earth, is that the end? Does that mean that all there is earth? Or Kalev says, no, it's a holy place. On the contrary, putting Sarah in the earth tells me that the earth is holy. Tells me that the earth will eventually reveal its secrets, which are, as we've been discussing, the dead, and of course Hashem will be able to see Hashem through his actions. Okay, these are the allusions, and although they are allusions and they are Mishalim, they also reflect very deep ideas that by thinking about the Mishalim deeply, you could also understand the ideas even deeper. So I encourage you to do that. And I don't want you to merely think about the Nimshal, which we're going to get to right now. I think it's very good to think about these things and also to see how beautifully all the parshas come together. It's amazing. Again, I have this essay attached, which if you look at that, you'll learn even more about this wonderfully rich matter. What's Lamaisa? Okay, so let's learn how to be successful Meraglim. So what we know is that in order to be a successful Meraglim, you always have to look for the inner truth of anything. Till now, we've been talking about trying to see things the way Hashem does, right? And what we're talking about now is a little bit different, and we'll get us to the same place. But now we're talking about something else. We're talking about don't try to look at things. Don't try to think, okay, how does Hashem look at this? But just take anything, and say, what's behind this? How do I use this surface thing that presents itself to me? How do I use it as a portal to understanding a deeper truth? Think to yourself, why does this look the way it does? Why is this here? What is it for? Everything has a reason. Everything is there. Everything can tell you some deeper truth. And we sort of know that on some level, but we often forget it, which is why we get totally crazy with how things look instead of thinking about what they mean. Let me give you an example. Let's say, okay, a mouth. You see a mouth. So you have to ask yourself, why does a person have a mouth? Oh, because he eats. Because through his mouth he puts in food to nourish his body. Why is there food to nourish a body? Because there's life. And because life is a principle, a value. There you go. So when you see a mouth, and you see it's unfortunate, some people will say, oh, it's a pretty mouth. Look at the shape of the lips. Stupidities. Why? because they're taking something as the surface instead of seeing a mouth and seeing it for what it's a manifestation of, which is great wisdom, Hashem's great wisdom, rooted in Hashem's interest, let's call it, or Hashem's principle of life is good, life is important. So now what you do is, your avodah is to look at something and to always think, why is it here? Why does it look the way it does? What principle, what truth about reality does it represent? Otherwise, what you're doing is, which unfortunately we do too much, we take the surface of things as being the absolute reality. And really the surface is just a portal, a representation, and a portal to some inner reality. So instead of living in this world of chitzonius, in this world where the externality is basically we take it as a truth, we have the ability to situate ourselves mentally in the inner world, in the true world, namely the world that gives rise to all these externalities. And that way every surface can serve as a portal to the truth. And that's when your clothing has tzitzis on them. When your clothing, the externalities, are not taken as being the end-all, the be-all and end-all, but rather taken as an allusion to something deeper that lies behind them, something that we will eventually access in its fullest sense. And when we access that in its fullest sense, we've beaten death and we've beaten evil. And there's only Tov, there's only Chaim, and then we see HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So this idea of looking this way is, of course, to get to the same place. It's in order that we should see things the way Hashem does. But what this whole tzitzis thing did for us is that it gives us another way. Till now we've been talking about just take something and ask yourself, how does Hashem see this? What is this to Hashem? And now there's another way. I think what tzitzis is doing is gives us another way to get to the proper sight, which is to look at something and say, why is this here? And of course you could do it with artificial things too. There's a mug. Why is there a mug? Because there's something called drinking. Why is there drinking? Etc. And you could do that with everything. And you could use everything as it's like basically forcing yourself to focus on the basic truths and forcing yourself to be inspired by the basic truths instead of being led astray by the surface, by how pleasing something is to the eye. You instead think about what does it represent in its essence. That will be all for now. Next weekly neder, we're going to talk about one other aspect of Eretz Yisrael, how it connects to the Akedah, and how we can be Metaher and be Mekadesh on Eretz.